what is the damn potato dog commander, the stacks potato dog that everybody's playing in CDH? Counters, remove counters, recur stuff from graveyard, stacks deck.
What?
Very popular stacks deck right
Tyam.
now.
That's a dog?
Tyam. It's a dog. Tyam's a
What?
dog. I say potato because Tyam looks like a potato.
Hey everybody, it's me, Moderately Anonymous MTG. I am here with Ken Bauman today from cEDH, and we are going to talk about some mistakes that you might be making when evaluating cards for your cEDH decks. Just quickly before we get into it, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Wizards of the Coast. Huge thank you to them for supporting cEDH and sponsoring this theory content. If you want to make sure they keep supporting the show, go use the link in our video description to pick up some Wild to Beldrain cards. And without further ado, let's hop into it. I'm here with Ken Bauman today, and we are here to talk about what makes a card good in cEDH. And before we start talking about that, I think that we should probably talk about the baseline of what makes a card good in cEDH in general. What are good cards in cEDH? How are we defining that? What meets those expectations? So Ken, what do you think are some of the best cards in cEDH and why?
Yeah, so I think that there are a few hallmark qualities of cards that are great in cEDH, and a lot of them overlap with actually cards that would be great in a regular casual pot of Commander too, like Rhystic Study. You know, it is incredibly cracked and asymmetrical and wildly effective at drawing cards, no matter what power scale you play it at. That, I think, is a quintessential cEDH card that shows you, hey, for 3 mana, you can potentially draw a game-winning amount of cards within a turn or two. And that investment, that rate, is crazily good. Unconditional tutors, like Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, those are allowing you to increase the consistency of your deck so greatly at, again, such a low mana investment that those are also hallmarks. And then you have cards like Compact Win Conditions, like Underworld Breach and Brain Freeze, or Thassa's Oracle and Tainted Pact. You have 2 card combos in various colors that close out the game on the spot or close out the game with the addition of a 3rd card. Once you're in the territory of like 4+ card combos, you're really sort of outside the realm of average cEDH circumstances. So you can probably see that all of these cards have the quality of efficiency and low mana investment for high, potentially very, very high reward.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that you talked about is something that we actually just covered on the show here, card economy, and how much you need to get out of a card to make it a good card. And I think those are probably some of the defining factors between having a card that has a lot of juice in it or having a card that is just so undeniably efficient or powerful that it becomes one of the de facto cards in cEDH. I was thinking about, we tend to see a lot of similar cards in most decks in the cEDH meta. I think Angie Falconwrath, Anya Falconwrath is probably still the deck with the most unique cards in it. So like air quotes, maybe bad cards in it, because they're not, the consensus is not that these are the best cards and that's why we're playing it. Those are more very contextual. So I was trying to think of what are some of the decks that have the highest density of cards that are shared among other decks. I would have to imagine that like Blue Farm is up there.
Yeah, I think when you're in 4+ colors and 5+ colors, you are probably playing one, maybe, unique card, like one card that you won't find in any other deck. And I think that's even a stretch now in the 4 and 5 color range. I think you might see it more often in 3 color, for instance, Time Civ and Tivit. And so you're in a 3 color deck that already shows you how bountiful your card selection is. Once you're in 3+ colors, really the world's your oyster. You can just play so many of the most historically effective Magic cards ever printed that you don't really have to play unique cards to support your strategy. And once you're in 2 colors and below, then things start to get a little wacky.
In terms of those high color decks, what do you think are some of the benchmarks that we need to clear for a new card to be able to break into one of these decks? I guess the One Ring is one of the more recent cards that is just so undeniably good that it's seeing quite a bit of play. I don't quite know what the numbers are yet because I think there hasn't really been enough tournament data since it's come out to really see where people have landed on it. But what are some other scenarios where you see cards being good enough? Like what are some of those qualities of a card in a new card that makes it good enough to try to see play in some of those really tight deck lists?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I like to kind of remind myself of how pretty recent Esper Sentinel and Ranger Captain are, and I think Esper Sentinel's a great example again of a card whose rate is immediately and obviously incredible in a 4-player game. The investment is as little as possible. If not free, then the cost is 1. And Esper Sentinel is that and says, hey, your ceiling is draw 20 cards. You know, if the game drags on and you've got irresponsible opponents, which God bless, may you always have irresponsible opponents when you have a card draw engine like that, you will win the game off of 1 mana investment. Ranger Captain has an activated ability, and activated abilities are very hard to interact with in cEDH. People rarely, if ever, play Stifle effects, and that activated ability is essentially silent, so it could be proactive and defensive, and all of that also on a body that immediately tutors up card like Esper Sentinel. And so you see again how multifaceted cards need to be. If the mana investment is 3+, a card needs to do a little bit of everything. If the mana investment is 1 or 2, it needs to stop a win, have the potential to stop a win, or set up a win. And that's why you can see cards like Esper Sentinel, they're so pushed, because not only can it stop a win by drawing you cards with which you can interact, but it can set up a win by drawing you cards with which you can combo, and it can attack, right? It actually can be sometimes relevant in combat, so it can pressure life total. So it's relevant in 3 different directions, all for 1 mana, and that's like almost unparalleled. So yeah, I think when new cards come out, like the One Ring, you gotta see how they play. You gotta see what other formats do with them. You gotta try them out yourself. But at 4 mana or 3 mana, a card really has to do incredible things, and obviously, the One Ring is one of those cards.
I think that's a really good point, especially when thinking about a card like Ranger Captain of Eos. The amount of different axes that card plays on is really interesting, where it is the tutor, it is a 3 mana 3/3 body, which is like certainly not irrelevant in a more creature heavy meta at the moment, and the silence effect, which if we're looking at that card and Esper Sentinel side by side as we did, both of those cards represent a lot of card advantage. Esper Sentinel in literally drawing you cards, Ranger Captain in stopping a very wide variety of interaction that your opponents can possibly have. Not all of it, but it does cover the most usual suspects in terms of card disruption from your opponents. And I think the One Ring, there was a very interesting conversation about that card as well when it first came out, of like, we all know that drawing cards is good, but I think a lot of people were questioning, like, it's going to come down to how good is getting protection from everything when it enters the battlefield after you cast it. And in my experience, it's been extremely valuable. It creates for those incredibly weird scenarios. It's not the most usual, like, obviously, usually we're losing to Brain Freeze and Underworld Breach, but there are so many different kinds of win cons, like Najeela, Glinthorn Buccaneer, and Praetor's Grasp, and things like that, that the ability to not be able to damage or target your opponent is actually, I guess, a lot more relevant than people were initially giving it credit for.
Absolutely. I've seen it become very, very relevant in late games. I've seen it be relevant in early games with, against decks like Winota or Najeela, where life total really matters. And I've also seen people forget that they can't Brain Freeze themselves if they have cast the One Ring on that turn, which is very funny. I mean, they were just drowning in riches. They had all the mana in the world, and they were just spinning their wheels and cast Brain Freeze, and it was like, sorry, you just got. I mean, they still won that game. Surprise, surprise, right? They're able to Brain Freeze everybody else. But I think also people didn't really kind of just think about that card slowly and methodically in a cEDH perspective from the math, through the math, because like, look, we're turn 5 on average, plus or minus 2 turns on either side. We're turn 5 metagame, and if you land that turn 1 or 2, which that's where you're really trying to prioritize it, it's going to draw you a hell of a lot of cards for a very small investment in terms of life, and it's a lot less conspicuous than something like Ad Nauseam. Ad Nauseam, it's like, okay, you wait, ideally, maybe your main phase in it, but ideally you instep it and you have 5 mana and everybody knows what's coming for the most part. But the Ring can really come out of nowhere, come early with something like Mana Vault or Grim Monolith, and then just hang out kind of forever. And cards that can kind of just hang out forever on the battlefield and accrue advantage every turn, like Rhystic Study, like Esper Sentinel, like Ranger Captain too, by attacking with Tymna or just being a insurance policy, those are the cards that win games.
This is something I've been thinking about recently, and I really want to start tracking this, of how many cards am I drawing in the average game with a Rhystic Study versus the One Ring, because the One Ring, I feel like I am generally drawing 6 cards, and I'm not quite sure if that's true in the same time frame with Rhystic Study. I generally find people are a lot more responsible about Rhystic Study than they once were in the Grixis Turbo summer days. I don't know. It could easily go either way, though, because it very much depends on who you're playing with. But like you said, there's a certain, I think even against Rhystic Study, there's a certain amount of like innocuous nature to the One Ring, where it is balanced out a little bit by the fact that you're taking damage. There is only so much of it that you can do at one time. You're not, basically, I think the big difference is that Rhystic Study makes you worried about things that you can't control, whereas the One Ring is something that your opponent is either going to be able to tap it once per turn, or they're going to be able to tap it twice per turn if they have a Manifold Key or something like that. But it's something that you can basically account for, where Rhystic Study is not really a thing that you can account for.
Absolutely. And you using your words is not going to affect the One Ring player activating the One Ring and drawing cards. You using your words could potentially affect the other 2 opponents from giving the Rhystic Study player the game. And so there's also psychological pressure with Rhystic Study, where it's like, when it lands, everybody then has to play the social game. And if they don't, then the Rhystic Study player or the Esper Sentinel player, they just win. Or the Fish player, they just win. And they don't have to do much else. They just let other people be irresponsible and usually have enough gas to go for and protect it. But yeah, the One Ring, yeah, you're absolutely right. You can budget around it. You can budget around it, you can plan around it, you can be like, okay, cool, we probably have 1 more turn because, they just drew 2 extra cards. That's pretty bad. But next turn drawing 3 extra cards is probably going to put them over the top. Like, it's, that's a pretty safe calculation. In Rhystic Study, you just never know. All it takes is one opponent who just decides to go nuts, and there you go, you lose the game.
And that is truly just the nature of some of the decks that are in the meta too, to just like not care about Rhystic Study. I'm looking at like the Mardu or Grixis decks in particular. Well, I'm not here to play around that thing. I'm here to play quickly and win. And when they don't win, everyone else is dealing with the consequences. Whereas, yeah, at least with the One Ring, it is a very finite thing, and you can plan for it in that different kind of way. So speaking to the opposite end of this spectrum, where we're talking about 4-color decks and what makes the cut for those really tight deck lists, you are a very logically minded person, I find, and your 2-color deck, Kark and Sakashima, are you looking at like the strict mathematics when, say, cards like Flick the Coin? I don't even remember what that card does, but
you don't need to. It's fine.
How much of the math are you looking at when you're considering new cards for Kark and Sakashima that has a higher rate of spots that are a little bit more flexible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice thing. 2-color deck, kind of a unique engine, so we get to play, probably like 5 to 8-ish cards that you won't see anywhere else, or you might see them in like 1 or 2 other decks. But so we have more flexible slots, and I think really that mana value rubric is the primary thing I use to evaluate cards. So taking a card like Flick a Coin, for an example, that's a 2 and a red instant. It says deal damage somewhere, draw a card, make a treasure. And if that were 1 and a red, everybody, I mean, it would be no question. Every Kark Sakashima player would be playing it immediately. But the 2 and a red really shows you how much mana investments matter. Kark Sakashima is kind of unique, though, because you really have to evaluate spending mana and then nothing happening, which you don't often have to evaluate in other contexts. Other decks can just put spells on the stack successfully, which is pretty cool. But it's still, you have to think like, okay, this is a 3-mana spell. What benefit does it provide? And then if I've spent 3 mana, that means that I have 3 mana less to spend on interacting again, or trying for another draw or whatever. And so you really have to evaluate cards in terms of tempo and being like, how much mana am I actually realistically going to spend in a 5-turn game? Like how many opportunities am I going to have to tap out on an instep or whatever and spend 3 mana on something? And so again, 1 mana cards are always at play. Every 1 mana card should be looked at. 2 mana cards, you think Demonic Tutor, right? If your 2 mana card is not a Grim Monolith or a Demonic Tutor or something like that, you don't need to look too hard at it. And then 3 mana, it needs to be something obviously busted, like Jessica's Will, like that. Or Ranger Captain or something. It has to do a little bit of everything, and it has to be very impactful and put you well ahead when it resolves.
Yeah,
and that rate is unfortunately just
of like Necropotence and Yawgmoth's Will and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and that rate is just unfortunately like a reality. It's just what we got to deal with,
Yeah, I think it's really easy to, I guess if you're going to do like a strict comparison of just 3 mana spells and what you can think of off the top of your head, like is Flick the Coin as good as Rhystic Study or Necropotence? No, not by a long shot. So I think it's a little bit easier to evaluate on that spectrum. When I think about Kark, maybe this is incorrect, but I also tend to think about, in the video about cantrips, I talk about Kark and how one of the reasons that decks like Kark want to run cantrips is because they're fundamentally breaking the part of cantrips that is not good in cEDH, which is the card economy of them. Like we talked about before, like replacing a card in your hand is just it's not good enough for this format. It doesn't do enough. A random card off the top of your library doesn't do a whole lot for the most part. You really want to be finding specific cards. That's why Vampiric Tutor is obviously a much better way to spend 1 mana than a Ponder in general. But getting 2 Ponders, getting 3 Ponders, that is a much different ballpark. Getting like literal card advantage off of your cards is a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that again, every card's got to be evaluated contextually with the deck that you're thinking about it for, and every cEDH deck should probably break a fundamental rule of Magic, right? Like Tymna does that. Tymna says, hey, how about drawing more than 1 card a turn every turn? Pretty cool. Rograk says, hey, how about free spells and rituals and interaction immediately with no further investment? And Najeela is just like, we get to do a little bit of everything. So again, the commander for a cEDH list, it has to break the rules. It can't just slightly alter the game in your favor. It has to really be game warping. And so that's why evaluating cards like cantrips in the context of certain decks is going to be different. Like a Ponder in a deck with 22 lands, I would imagine is going to be a lot better than in a deck with 30 lands. So again, context matters, even beyond the commander.
Yeah, I agree with that. And this really hits on the conversation that you and I had at Lewis' house when we were recording for the Spry Babies that inspired me wanting to make this video with you, which is a card has to be real messed up to be good.
Yeah. You have to look at it and go like, that was a mistake.
Genuinely, you have to look at a card and say, I must be reading this wrong.
Yes, exactly. I mean, one can imagine in 94 people reading Necropotence, and then when they got it, be like, wait, what? I can draw 15 cards right now, like in my instep. I can, for 3 mana, like that can't really be real. But indeed, like those are the kinds of cards, those are the kinds of effects that make a competitive archetype viable. And yeah, so I think that's a fun part about cEDH card evaluation is yes, there's sometimes cards that fill a niche, right? Like Tavern Scoundrel, that's a good example for Kark Sakashima. It was like, hey, that thing you're already doing with your commander, well, now that can make mana. Great, niche filled. But otherwise, you got to look at the card and go, historically, in Magic's history, is this like a real contender for the best effect at this rate? And if the answer is no, you don't have to play it, and probably shouldn't. And that's the fun part of cEDH. You get to jam your deck full of just all the historically most impactful, powerful, fast, efficient cards.
That's one of my most certain references is like, is this card in a legacy deck? Has it been in a vintage deck? Has this been used in one of the more obscenely powerful formats in Magic before? And if not, it's probably not hitting the mark for cEDH either.
Yeah, a good rule of thumb when you're editing a cEDH list is add more banned cards.
Yes.
Over the last year or so, I've been practicing that pretty frequently, and I rarely regret it. I'm usually, when I draw those cards, I'm like, yeah, I get it. This is pretty good.
On the opposite end of the spectrum from cards that are obscenely powerful, what about cards that are like very close to the line? And the card that in particular that I'm thinking about is a card like Stern Scolding or a Spell Snare has been a much longer in the cEDH meta, but is equally in that sort of spot of it doesn't really see a lot of play, but it is extremely efficient.
Yeah.
Yes, but where do you think cards like that miss the mark? Are you in favor of those kinds of cards? I'm gonna say by your face that you're not really. I know that you used to play Spell Snare, I think, in Krark, right?
Yeah, I was on it for a little while, and I mean, here's the problem with one-mana interaction, or the challenge of one-mana interaction. Let's think about two cards that sort of, in my mind, summarize one-mana interaction: Mental Misstep and Flusterstorm. Mental Misstep is free. Okay, so that's already, my God, incredibly relevant. The fact that it is a narrow counterspell doesn't matter as much because you're playing, again, in a metagame in which 1 mana is the benchmark for interaction. So this is always going to be live when it matters. Then let's think about Flusterstorm. The damn card has Storm on it for 1 mana. So you are facing, again, mechanics that broke entire formats at 1 mana. So when you have a conditional counterspell like Stern Scolding or Spell Snare at 1, it still is competing with that. So unless you are probably literally just like Swords to Plowshares, which is still and will forever be the best piece of creature removal ever printed. Unless you are that, you have to do something incredibly, again, format-alteringly good. And so I do like quote-unquote narrow interaction at 1 mana, but I think you actually have to really know a metagame in order to justify including it. But if you're just kind of building for an average meta or for tournaments or whatever, I think that cards like that really struggle to shine,
It's a very good point that you bring up about Flusterstorm and Mental Misstep, again, representing card advantage in some form or another, where Mental Misstep you get to cheat on mana and not needing that resource that we need to represent on the board, or with Flusterstorm being able to represent many, many different counters all at once in a single card, or you have to be as good as Swords to Plowshares, one of, no, I'll straight up agree with you, just the best removal spell that has ever been printed in Magic. Swords does fall into that category of like card disadvantage in our 1v3 scenario, but it is just in that category of cards that is so powerful, it is undeniably good.
Yeah, exactly. Like the Mind Break traps and the Flusterstorms of the world are very rare, when you can actually get a 6-for-1 and break into card advantage. But and so or Toxic Deluge, or like very aggressively costed Wraths, effective Wraths, they will get you into card advantage land, but you don't always need card advantage. Sometimes you just need to not lose, and oftentimes not losing doesn't require 6-for-1; it requires a 1-for-1. And so they're just sort of, I think of inefficient. In other words, card advantage inefficient interaction that's still mana efficient is just like a necessary evil. You just gotta play some of it, and how much of it, that's up to your tastes.
In cEDH, I would also argue that there are many different, in all of Magic, there are many different forms of card advantage, but I think they're probably the most abundant in cEDH, and what comes to mind for me is cards like Soul Ring and Mana Crypt that fundamentally cheat on the amount of resources that you've invested into the table via like extra land drops, basically time walking all of your opponents if you have these objects and they don't. Things like that can like represent that kind of card advantage is, I think, what really allows you to be able to run other cards like Swords to Plowshares that don't take advantage of that angle as well.
That's a great point. That we are allowed to play inefficient cards only because we play the most incredibly over-efficient cards ever made.
Yeah, like if you talk to any 1v1 player, a control player knows that you can't spend your Force of Will on the first spell that comes down. Your resources are precious even in a 1v1 scenario, and you need to wait for the correct moments to use them. But yeah, being able to push yourself so drastically forward, being able to cast the Dockside Extortionist in the year of our Lord 2023 allows for truly miraculous events.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You're like, Dockside Extortionist is much like Swords to Plowshares is the best removal spell ever printed. Dockside Extortionist is, in the perspective of a multiplayer format, the best ritual ever printed, and it costs 2. So it's like we're just in a kind of bizarro world where normal math, 1v1 math, doesn't really apply unless you're at like legacy or vintage levels, and sometimes at like modern levels of mana investment and card quality and stuff like that. But most of the time you're in legacy and vintage land, which is Yeah, those are the sort of benchmarks that you should have in mind. It's like, is this card good enough to see play regularly in those formats and or be banned or restricted? If yes, yeah, probably give it a shot. And that's what you want to measure new cards against.
I am always very keenly looking at what is being added to the Vintage Cube on Magic Online, and I know that they have an obligation to just add random cards from the new sets. But, you know, I'm a very big fan of watching people like LSV who are extremely talented at cube drafting. So watching their reactions to these cards and seeing what they think about these cards in different contexts, I think is always extremely helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing about new cards is you are not going to be alone in evaluating this. Just look at the pros. You know, and look at the pros and see what they do first, but always again keep in mind that we just have different rates and tempos and goals in cEDH than you do in 1v1 Pro Magic. But a lot of the same principles are going to apply. Those pros are going to be saying, hey, is this rate good enough? Is this effect broad or flexible enough? And or does it like plug a hole in a strategy or create a new strategy or combo? And if the answer to one of those questions is yes, it's probably going to see a little bit of play. And I think that the standard, the criteria for cEDH, I think kind of in many cases has to be higher. It's got to have more bang for its buck, just because again, you draw 7 cards, your collective opponent draws 21. You play land, they play 3 lands. Like, it's just, you are fighting an uphill battle immediately. And that's why cards like Rhystic Study, Esper Sentinel, they will win games because they can actually crack into multiplayer mass land.
It's also why we see the most popular commanders being things like Tymna and Crom that just fundamentally are drawing cards, or in the case of Kark and Sakashima, just fundamentally breaking the way that your cards work and making them more efficient for their cost.
Yeah, exactly. Something that comes to mind a lot is Kennen, and how Kennen just says, hey, your command zone makes all the mana twice as much mana. And that, for a 2 mana investment, and now you're doubling your mana production, and you always have access to that in the command zone. Let's put aside the fact that it's an infinite mana outlet. That immediately says viable, you know. And so when or something like, I think a good kind of case of evaluating a new card was a Winota, right? Like Winota, I think initially when it was spoiled, I don't think that there was a large, you know, mob screaming for its entry into cEDH.
No, it took a minute to catch on, I remember.
Yeah, and it took someone really realizing, well, if we just use the whole card pool in Magic's history, we can create an engine that runs very consistently. But it really did take that design. Whereas something like, I'm going to use an example of a card that I think is good and I've played a little bit and I've liked, but it doesn't quite make the cut in a 3+ color deck. I look at a card like Cut Down. Cut Down is a great little piece of removal at 1 mana. It hits so much stuff that you want to get rid of. It doesn't affect your life total. It's narrow, but in cEDH it's a lot less narrow than you think it might be. But even still, that just cannot make the cut for most high color decks. And evaluating cards and is not only just identifying the ones that are sort of obviously should be in the conversation, low mana value cards that are broadly effective. We also need to look at cards that, again, either enable a new archetype like Winota or Krark, or plug a hole, right? Create like something like what is the damn potato dog commander, the Stacks potato dog that everybody's playing in cEDH? Counters, remove counters, recur stuff from graveyard. Stacks deck.
What?
Very popular Stacks deck right now.
That's a dog?
Thyam. It's a dog. Thyam's a dog. I say potato because Thyam looks like a potato, but Thyam is a dog. I thought it was
like a nightmare fox. That's what I would guess off the top of my head.
It probably is. It's not going to be card type dog, although that'd be cool. But Thyam, again, like you see that card fill a gap. It says, hey, we can win with activated abilities. And we're in rule law colors. Okay, cool. Gap, you know, filled. Hole plugged or whatever. So like that's how we're evaluating cards from both of those lenses.
I think that's probably one of the most important aspects, especially for those very efficient spells, because if you think about something like Stern Dismissal, something like Cut Down, there are so many options now at that mana rate. It really has to do something that other ones don't do in order to really beat that scenario, because the competition is just so stiff, and at the end of the day, you probably don't even want to run Cut Down because Swords to Plowshares is there.
Exactly right, yeah. And I mean, at one point, you know, I think that evaluating cards for individual decks also can kind of change the lenses you put on, because let's say, for example, you're playing a deck that you really want to be tutoring a lot, so you hate to see an opposition agent. That means, Yisan, we'll use that as an example, right? Opposition agent is Yisan's arch nemesis. Yisan plays a lot of stuff, and they're not great removal spells, but your options are kind of narrow in mono green, but it plays a lot of stuff that can kill an opposition agent, because they know, right? They know that this is a huge liability, so we need to dip out a card quality land and dip into just figure out how to not lose to a certain silver bullet. And But again, once you're in 3+ colors, you don't have to think about that as often, because usually, yeah, again, you'll have more tutors, you'll have more ways to find the Swords to Plowshares or recur it or whatever, that you don't really need to have quantity of answers to a liability. You really just need to have enough card quality that you can find the answer you need when you need it.
Yeah, and some
or
of the
pivot
decks too. Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that in some of the strongest decks, one of the best options to have against a stack space you can't beat is to simply win a different way.
They reward flexibility, they reward kind of flexible players who aren't going to tunnel vision on one kind of win, and they reward pods in which decks have those silver bullets where, you know, maybe they'll feel a little comfortable, like, oh, we got the Grafdigger's Cage, you're not going to be able to finale Devastation, haha. But it's like, okay, I don't need the finale, I'll just go do this other thing. And it's, yeah, it really provides a flexibility that, again, lends itself to evaluating cards and saying, hey, can this card support multiple game plans, not just one, or not just one effect, but can this go multiple different ways?
That's really interesting, especially in regards to the 3-color decks, where a lot of that value and the ability to pivot also, it doesn't even come from the fact that you are more colors, because a lot of these decks aren't running multicolored cards. They're just running more efficient versions of probably the same cards, but because you have slightly more options spread out among your colors, you get to diversify to a higher quality, I suppose.
Yeah, and also just like as you broaden your card pool by broadening your color identity in Commander, you just gain access to the magical world of more 2-card combos. And that is cEDH's bread and butter. It really is. Like, it is a combo format. Everybody is playing, more or less, everybody's playing a combo deck. The combos are just maybe a little bit more command zone reliant or a little more convoluted, but you're looking to assemble a couple of cards together and win the game with them, or a few cards together and win the game with them. You can even look at a deck like Winota as a combo deck. Yes. It's Winota plus like 1 or 2 non-humans, right? And then that's it. There you go. That's all you need. Or Krark Sakashima too. It's Manual Storm, but it's Krark plus a ritual and a way to draw cards. And so if you have those 3 things, then you're rolling. And so, yeah, just looking at cards from the perspective of, is this going to help me get into or out of a 2 or maybe 3-card combo effectively? Like, does this enable one? Does this find one? Does this disrupt one? That is a very important question too, I think, to ask of most cards that you see.
The 2 decks that you're on right now, Krark and Sakashima and Tymna and Kamal? Kodama
now, yeah.
Which of those decks are you currently testing more cards in?
Tymna Kodama is more the work in progress. Like, Krark Sakashima might change it relatively frequently, kind of based on what I think the deck might need for a stranger playing into kind of just a random meta. But
Tymna Kodama is like a little bit more of your personal thing, right?
It's just been it's been like a hell of an experiment, you know. Because I at first I was like, I want to do a stacks deck. I was playing Selesnya, and I was like, I don't like this. I'm not winning enough. I want to do a stacks deck with 3 colors, and Tymna seems like a great card. So I want to play a Tymna deck. Tymna is a great card. And then I was like, hey, you know what seems cooler than preventing other people from winning? It's winning the game myself. I finally began to go to that church, you know, the Modanon church of just win the game. Just do it. Just put up a win attempt over and over and over again. And then I started to get real hooked on that because it kept working. I was like, damn, I'm winning games. Turns out when you try to win more often, you win more often. Yeah. It's crazy how that works. And then I was like, I switched off Kamal because I was like, Kamal doesn't really support a super proactive game plan in a way that I like. So let's do Kodama. Kodama has some kind of compact combos and lines that are really nice, and also just like a pretty nonsensical mid-range value piece. If
it cheats a lot more than Kamal does, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It breaks the rules of Magic. Yeah. An Overrun for 8 mana doesn't do that. But a thing that says, hey, your cards are now extra cards for free is, yeah, that's pretty good. And so in evaluating cards, what I really have had to do is test packages of cards, you know, and be like, okay, am I playing Oof effects? Am I playing Null Rod, Stony Silence, Collector Oof? All 3 of them? Am I playing Karn? Am I playing 4 of them? Am I playing none of them? Am I playing reanimate spells, like reanimate, animate, dead, necromancy, whatever? Or am I playing none of them? Or maybe just 1? And I've gone back and forth that way many, many times until I've now finally settled on a build that feels good. But evaluating individual cards when you're brewing a deck is very difficult. But evaluating, hey, this card is kind of like 2 or 3 other cards. I'm just going to throw them all in. I'll see them more often, and then also know, like, am I looking for this effect really or not? That's a lot easier.
Okay, this is actually a perfect segue, because yeah, what I wanted to ask you is, if, when you find a new card that you are determined that you want to test in your deck, what does that testing look like?
Yeah, so the One Ring was just sort of a no-brainer. I thought, once the math clicked in my head, I was like, I'm just going to put this in both my decks, because you know what I like? I like drawing cards, and I like cards that break formats, and the One Ring is both of those things. But yeah, so the One Ring, I was like, okay, I want to throw that in, and then it really posed a question. I was like, I'm playing a Null Rod deck. I'm playing the One Ring. how often is that going to come up? Is that going to be a problem? And through playing, I found that it wasn't a problem as nearly as often as I thought it would be. And then I was sort of reminded, like, we're playing a singleton format. You're not going to run in 2 different kinds of effect in every game. It just ain't going to happen. And you also have choices as a player, right? So if you go one route, you can just not go the other route. But then I got to a point where I just kept looking at my data, looking at my games, analyzing them, and I started noticing the One Ring came up as a great card a lot more often than Collector Roof or Null Rod or Stony Silence. And I was like, I don't think I can get away anymore with playing Null Rod effects, because fast mana is good, and Kodama wants me to have permanence. So I was like, I can play an Arcane Signet, and Fellwar Stone, and a Grim Monolith, and those cards are good with Kodama. They're good with Kodama, they're good with Ad Nauseam, they're good with the One Ring. Like, I think I just should get rid of that package and make a change, and I did, and I haven't really regretted it at all. It's been very nice, but that has been the question. It's like a new card comes out, and I go, okay, what packages need to change or shift or exit or enter here? Testing effects in multiples is really probably the only way to do it, because statistically, if you want to evaluate how good one single card is in your cEDH deck, and you want to do kind of a statistically robust evaluation of that card, you ain't gonna do it unless you're playing hundreds of games.
So many.
Yeah, it's too many games. And so, like, you can get a good sense, you can get a gut sense, you can evaluate the card as it's in your hand and how it affects certain games and make notes of that. But really, multiple effects is the way to go, I think.
Is there any concise list that you would give, like a sort of checklist of, like, when you're looking at a new card, what makes it good?
So I put in this article on Commander's Herald about cEDH that I wrote, I put my kind of mana rubric, and I check cards against this rubric all the time. And it's pretty simple. 1 mana stops a win. 2 mana sets up a win. 3 mana puts you so far ahead of your opponents that it's going to be hard for them to claw back. 4 mana is you win the game in a turn or 2, and a 4 mana plus, obviously. And so I think that mana rubric will be a good rule of thumb for folks. You can just kind of use that and evaluate cards with that in mind. But I think, like, what makes a card good, mana value is always the first thing I look at, and using this rubric helps. And then I look at modality, right? Like, how many directions can this card go? Like, let's imagine there was a 1 mana blue spell that was like a little cryptic command. It was like it had 3 different modes, and you could choose one. So it wasn't just the Stern Scolding, or it wasn't just the spell snare. It was like, hey, counter a spell with mana value 2, or bounce a non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less, or some other thing, right? That would be very, very compelling, because you have options, and options are great. Like, thinking about cards in terms of optionality, in other words, how many worlds exist in which this card is a good card? And the more worlds that exist in which the card's a good card, the more contexts that exist in which card's a good card. That means that card is going to be more often applicable to your situation at any given time. And so modes are good, options are good. And then really the third thing, kind of like the gut check, is just like, does this do something really splashy? Like Jessica's Will. Like, holy crap. Okay, that's like probably 4+ mana, usually 5+ mana, and cards for 3 mana. That's wild. It's wildly efficient. Very, very splashy. Can win you the game more or less that turn. And so, like, the splashy effect should be obvious ad nauseum. Like, it should be just screamingly obvious that this does something that is very powerful and very asymmetrical. It's not play a land, draw a card, pass the turn. It's you do a lot of stuff right now. And then, yeah, again, otherwise it's just mana. And then also combo potential, right? Is like, if this card is part of a 2-card combo in any context, look at it. Because, like, that, again, that's cEDH's bread and butter, So combo potential, mana value, splashiness, and I think that those are really going to help you evaluate a card soundly.
I think that's probably everything, unless there's anything else that you wanted to talk about.
I want to just make sure that I toot the variance horn and say that that's me doing it. I'm tooting the variance horn. If it's just voiceover right now, imagine me doing that. Just remember that cEDH is an incredibly high variance version of an incalculably complex game. So don't expect, even if you see a great slam dunk card, you're not going to see it as often as you want. It's not going to be as consistent as you want, just because that's just the nature of the game. And lean into that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We want to make our decks as consistent and as efficient as possible in cEDH. That's a very cool thing, but it is extremely difficult to do that. And so don't put all your hopes and dreams on one card. I think the One Ring is an awesome card. I tutor it up often. I cast it often. My friend Evan counters it every damn time because they hate me having fun, I guess. But it's not like I pin all my hopes and dreams for every game on that card. It's one of many tools. And so keeping that in mind when you're looking at a new card, like, all right, is this a nice addition to my, like, cool little toolbox with which I get to solve all sorts of problems? And don't look at cards any more importantly than that, unless you want to, unless it's fun. But you know, don't bank your hopes and dreams on one piece of cardboard.
One more big shout out to Wizards for sponsoring the show today. Again, if you want them to keep supporting the show, go use the link in our video description to pick up yourself some Wild of Eldraine cards. And thank you so much for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.